Welcome to the Gospel According to Star Trek podcast. I'm Kevin C. Neese.
And I'm Mike Poteet, and you're listening to episode 32, The Needs of the Many. We're going to start with some Star Trek news.
And then we're going to get into our audience question right after our main topic, The Needs of the Many, where we're going to be talking about Spock as a Christ figure. It's going to be appropriate for this Easter season, and we hope you enjoy it. Stick around. Well, Mike, did you have a good Easter Sunday?
Had a very nice Easter Sunday, thanks. Yeah, we were able to get together with the in-laws on the deck for a socially distanced outdoor barbecue for our celebration.
Oh, wow. That's fantastic.
And it was a nice day. How about you and yours?
That's good. We had a good time with family as well. My dad cooked a ham, and I cooked some potatoes, and the kid chased down Easter eggs in a greatly expanded area than usual, front and backyard. So it was lots of fun. We had a good time.
Were those bunny corn potatoes, Kevin?
No, I don't even know what those are. I don't know what that is.
Well, bunny corn pizza.
What? I don't know what that is.
Bunny corn pizza from Star Trek Picard that Riker makes.
Oh, is that? Oh, bunny corn. Oh, bunny corn. I knew it sounded familiar. I was like, oh no, this is a Star Trek reference I should get, isn't it?
Uh-oh. You're off your game tonight.
I might cut this part. See, this is the thing. I have the power of final edit.
You go ahead and cut it out. Yep.
Yeah. So it was a good time. We enjoyed it. Yeah, and yesterday, or actually no, I guess today, as we're recording this is First Contact Day.
It is.
I'm amazed that this has become such a big thing in Star Trek.
Yeah. How long has it? I was trying to find out the other night for something else I was doing. When did it become a thing to actually celebrate First Contact Day? I mean,
I remember I wrote a blog post about First Contact Day in like 2012 or something like that.
Okay.
And so it was around. It was kind of a fan thing, but I don't think like Viacom, CBS, Paramount, and whoever really got behind it until like last year.
Yeah. Well, I know
last year it was like an official thing.
Right. And apparently that's going to be the pattern, because one of the announcements today was the next big official in-person Star Trek convention will be the weekend of First Contact Day in Chicago next year.
Really?
So, yeah.
Cool. Just diving right in with the Star Trek news there.
Oh, they had tons. Yeah, they had one of the nice things about working from home, as I'm doing, is I can put on what I want in the background, and I had Star Trek First Contact Day on in the background. So.
Oh, that's awesome. See, I haven't gotten to see a lot of it. I got to see the this is our Star Trek news segment, by the way. I got to see the First Contact panel with where Will Wheaton was interviewing Alice Krieg. I was trying to say Krieg, and then I second guessed myself. Alice Krieg and Jonathan Frakes and Brent Spiner and Patrick Stewart, and that was really, really cool.
It was a great conversation.
Yeah, it was fantastic. Of course, all that's available on YouTube. You can go check it out because it's lots of cool stuff. But we got some news.
We do. They dropped a whole bunch of news on us today. The first thing was the teaser trailer for season 2 of Picard. Did you get a chance to watch that?
Yes.
I was not expecting where it was going. I mean, I guess we can talk about it, right? By the time people hear this.
We're going to talk about this stuff.
If
this is spoilerish for you, then you can skip it or go watch this stuff real quick and then come back to us. But yeah, so I love the
trailer. That was so masterfully done. I mean, It reminded me a lot of Generations, actually, where Picard starts off talking about how the final frontier is time.
Oh, yeah.
That resonated with me with Generations. And then we pan over all the various objects in his room and end up on a playing card on was it a chessboard?
Yeah.
Yeah, and it was like a queen, the face card, the queen. I thought, oh, maybe it'll be Borg related, but then everything except the corner Q in that card resolves away, and you hear John Delancey from the final episode of TNG, The Trial Never Ends.
Yeah, and I actually think that was probably newly recorded, actually.
Very well could be.
I think it's newly recorded. Oh my gosh, because I did when the Queen card came up, especially since I just watched the First Contact panel.
Right.
The Queen card is on the table, and I was like, Borg Queen, and then it's Q. So it's like, oh my gosh. And we know, I don't know if you remember this or if you were aware of this, but we know from like a couple of years ago, like when Picard season 1 was just about to air, and they were renewed for season 2, Patrick appeared on The View, and he on air asked Whoopi Goldberg to come back for season 2 of Picard. Yeah,
that's right.
That was pretty special.
That had not occurred to me that Q's coming could Guinan could not be far behind, because they have history. Yes. We know that from Q Who.
Right. So it's going to be really interesting to have both Guinan and Q in the mix in season 2 of Picard.
It will be. I love both those performers. I do hope they don't dispel too much of the mystery around Guinan. I'm kind of satisfied with the level of mystery around her. I hate to have it spoiled too much, but you know, we'll see.
We'll see. Yeah. Because I think that's one of the things that a lot of like prequels and sequels kind of do that can really get things messed up, is that they do a little bit too much explaining the background, you know, like
midichlorians.
Yeah. Matrix Reloaded. Yeah. So so what else did we have?
They had of interest to this podcast and its listeners, the documentary about Nichelle Nichols' work with NASA and much else, Woman in Motion, will be coming to Paramount Plus on June 3rd. So you'll want to go back and check out the episodes we did about that.
June 3rd. That's exciting. Yeah, check out those episodes. We did a review, and we also had an interview with the production team from the film. They're really great people, and we enjoyed that conversation. And it's a great film. So you can check it out on Paramount Plus soon. That's awesome. I'm glad they have a release date.
Yeah, and that will be coming up June 3rd. Like I said, Picard season 2, unfortunately, not until 2022. But we've got 3 other Trek projects coming this year. And the first they showed a trailer for was season 4 of Discovery.
Yes.
And you just saw that trailer recently.
I just watched it a moment ago.
Yeah. What'd you think?
I'm still like in the afterglow. I'm so excited.
I was, after the Picard trailer, which was very cool, but nobody in it, COVID protocols, whatever. I thought, okay, so I didn't have my hopes up too high for the Discovery trailer, but man, it's action packed, and the whole crew is there in brand spanking new uniforms, it looks like.
Yes.
And it's going to be exciting.
I think what you and I were talking about before we started recording is probably the case, that what we saw at the end of season 3 are the dress uniforms, and these are the duty uniforms, which makes more sense. I really felt like those uniforms were too formal for daily wear, so
they reminded me. And this isn't original to me, but they reminded me of Admiral Kirk's uniform in the motion picture, that nice gray and white thing we see him in first, but not a duty uniform apparently. So
right.
So but the new uniforms look great. They look sharp. All those nice solid primary colors.
Well, and there were flashes of different people. Adira has a new haircut that looks fantastic. I'm just like, that's so cool.
And they're in a Starfleet uniform, so properly part of the crew now officially.
Yes. That's exciting, and I will also say that Gray was there, and so I'm really curious as to whether this is an apparition of Gray or this is like Gray in physical form.
Yeah, they said we'd be seeing Gray, so I don't know. I missed that actually when I watched the trailer.
And we're also going to be seeing Saru. Saru was there.
Yes.
Looking awesome. He's in some kind of uniform. I'm excited to see what he's doing. And there was another Kelpian, a Kelpian on the bridge actually.
There was, and I guess it sounds like there's going to be another. At least my guess is there's another season long mystery, because one of the crew, I forget who, it might have been Tilly, might have been Owe, talking about a gravitational anomaly that's tracking right along with them, and
I think it was Tilly. Yeah.
I mean, that could just be threat of the week, but I bet they're teasing another season-long problem to be solved, puzzle to be demystified. Yeah.
Well, and we also saw Grudge, so that was cool.
I was really impressed just from those, what was it, a minute long? I don't know. And I liked this is something you and Tim talked about when you talked about Discovery. That emphasis on togetherness was there, too, because the last word of Burnham's narration in this teaser trailer is together. And
Yeah.
I appreciate you guys for pointing that out, but I appreciate how the show develops that theme of togetherness. I mean, they're really being very intentional about it, maybe more so than any of the other series. TNG talked a lot about family, but Discovery is really developing it quite nicely.
Well, TNG, and then also Deep Space Nine. In fact, I think it was Rick Berman who said that, or no, it was Mike Pillar, I think, who said that that Deep Space Nine is ultimately about family.
Yeah.
And so, I mean, that's very true there. But then also, I think that clinging to one another through adversity and finding that togetherness through adversity is a big theme in Discovery and is definitely carried on here. And I feel like there were sort of these accidental parallels between Pandemic Times and season 3. And I feel like with this gravitational anomaly thing that they're doing a more intentional
You could well
parallel.
be right, yeah.
I really think so, because they say something about, being, disoriented or feeling out of place or something like with that.
Right.
We felt that for a long time. We're used to that. And then, it could hit anybody, anywhere. It doesn't matter if you're Federation or non-Federation, you're at risk,
Right.
And so
Yeah.
it feels very much like a pandemic parallel. So I'm cautious about that in general, right? Just as a storytelling device, just going for that kind of parallel. But I trust Michelle Paradise and Tunde and everybody to make it right.
And the pandemic, I mean, it's more than just a rip from the headlines thing. I mean, I really do think this will prove to be a kind of generational, epical event.
Yes.
And for better and for worse, I think my son commented on this when he came home from college last March. He said, this is going to define my generation. And at this point, it's hard to see otherwise,
Right.
So I think that dealing with something of that magnitude, a fictional response to it in the Star Trek universe, could be very rich and very powerful and appreciated for a long time to come.
Yeah. Yeah, they tried to do it with the World Trade Center attacks in Enterprise.
Sure. Yeah.
They kind of, and there was some good stuff there, but I know this is going to be a season long thing. So that was a season long thing too. But,
it was, and it's the only season of Enterprise I haven't seen. If you can believe it, because I watched the first 2 and was, it was okay, but I gave up, and then I heard how great season 3 was, so I came back for season 4, and then it got canceled. So,
gosh.
So I do need to go back and watch the Xindi arc, because I've heard many good things about it.
It's good. I like it. Well, and then one other thing before we go to lighten the subject matter just a little bit, we also got to see the Lower Decks season 2 trailer. You can't see the face I'm making right now, but it's my fanboy squee face. It's really
Well, when they're putting their characters in the Ambo Jitsu suits, they're going for it. So.
Jitsu. Oh my gosh, it was wonderful. I'm so excited about it. I just and of course we're gonna have Boimler on board the Titan,
right?
And we get comic Riker again, which is gonna be great.
Yeah, one of my favorite comments in that comedy panel was when the creator of Lower Decks, and I'm sorry his name escapes me at the moment, but he was asked by Will Wheaton, how do you write for the established Trek characters in this comedic mode? And he said, well, like with Comic Riker, I said to Jonathan Frakes, what is Riker thinking that he could never say before? I'm paraphrasing what the question was, but that's how, so that was how the line in season 1 about Riker ordering warp factor to the time of 8 or whatever, some jazz reference, and you heard that again in the teaser trailer today. Riker doing jazz riffs on his command orders. So.
That's great. Yeah, I'm really excited for Lower Decks 2 and and Prodigy.
And Prodigy, we found out that Catherine Janeway's connection to Prodigy is she will be an emergency training hologram on this ship that these aliens in the Delta Quadrant find. So that's why they're species we don't recognize. Although he did tease that one of them has a connection to an original series alien race, so we can
Ah,
ponder that. But
okay.
but yeah, they're a group of kids in the Delta Quadrant who find this starship, and there's a Janeway emergency training hologram aboard. So, but
What?
they revealed the character design for Janeway, and she looks great. And I'm much I'm very excited about that show. I think it's going to be a lot of fun, based not only on that but on their descriptions of the premise and the intent.
Mhm.
It should be good.
What is the nature of your training emergency?
Right.
Yeah,
Apparently, they're going to have a lot of them because she's a regular character. So,
that's awesome. I'm so excited about it. I mean, we got our Janeway news in. Hey, look at that. After weeks of special episodes around here, we have a little bit of normalcy. We have Janeway news. That's awesome. Oh, I'm excited about it. That's very cool. So yeah, that's a lot of news. I was really hoping to get more specific release dates for everything. That was one thing I was expecting, honestly. And I should know by now the danger of expectations.
I imagine some things are just still in limbo given the pandemic.
That's true.
I mean,
that's very true.
I think one of the series, didn't Picard have to cease production for a while?
I think they did.
So,
I think they did. Or they were pushed back is what happened. They were going to
okay.
start and they were pushed back. I think they got pushed back a time or two. And so, yeah, it's going to be interesting to see how it works out because, I mean, my feeling was that Lower Decks, Lower Decks 2, Prodigy, and Discovery 4 were the three things that we could expect this year. And that Picard 2 and Strange New Worlds 1 would be next year. And that seems to be holding true.
Yeah.
So we'll see. Even though it makes our episodes harder to plan.
Yeah. How dare
Viacom,
they?
Paramount.
How dare
Come on.
they? I tell you. Where would they be without us, Kevin?
That's right. I know. Come on. We should have a little more consideration here.
I tell you, at one point today, Mika Burton on one of the panels, LeVar Burton's daughter, she was hosting a fair number of the panels, said that it was another golden age for Star Trek, and she's absolutely right. There's just so much great new stuff here and coming down the pike.
Yep.
Yeah.
Literally.
Yeah, no pun intended, but literally.
Yeah.
So it's exciting.
That's cool. Awesome. All right. Well, shall we get into our main topic for the day?
Yeah.
We talked about Easter at the top of this hour. I say hour at the top of this episode, and we didn't do anything specific like leading up to Easter, and we didn't do anything specific on Easter Sunday because March was flooded with special guests, which I loved.
Yeah, you had some great guests. I enjoyed your conversation with Blair last week. That was really
thank you.
So interesting and entertaining and insightful to listen
to.
To listen to her talk about her experiences was just really very powerful.
Yeah, I loved having her on the show. I thought it was a great way to end our Women's Future History Month. But it's nice, with Easter to kind of get back into some familiar territory, at least for me. I've been talking about Spock as a Christ figure for, a good decade. So
you have a few thoughts on the subject.
Yeah, I feel like I'm cheating. Like I already know this stuff, but yeah. So the interesting thing is, we didn't do anything specifically for Easter Day, but we're going to be talking about Easter stuff. We're going to be talking about Christ figures for 3 weeks, for 3 episodes.
And that's more than appropriate, since in traditions that observe a liturgical calendar, Easter is a season of 50 days, right up until Pentecost. So
right, exactly.
It's happy Easter from now till whenever Pentecost is.
Right. You should know this, sir.
I should know this. If I were still in the pastorate, I would know it. But
right. That's okay. You're forgiven.
It's going to come sometime in May.
Right. It's hard. It shifts every year, so it's hard to keep up with. But yeah. So we'll have at least these 3 weeks because we have 3 specific Star Trek Christ figures we want to talk about. The first one being Spock.
I'll tell you something I've not told anybody. I've not told anybody this, but it's interesting because after I'd seen Star Trek 3, that was when I got to be a Star Trek fan. I moved and met some friends who were into Star Trek, and so we were all really looking to Star Trek 4 together. But me, being of a writerly persuasion, I was going to try to write my own speculative script for what would happen in Star Trek 4.
Oh.
And so I knew part of the plot would have to be getting Spock back to normal, right? Because
Right.
he's clearly alive, but not quite himself at the end of Star Trek 3 just yet. So
Right.
I wrote, and I don't remember the ins and outs, and it's best that this thing is forgotten, but I wrote the beginning of a script in which McCoy was doing some sort of memory repair restoration thing to Spock, and so we scroll back through footage of the first two films and the series stuff, and then there's this void, and on the other side of the void we see Spock on the cross, and I don't
What?
know where the heck I thought I was going with that, and I quickly abandoned the project shortly thereafter because I realized, what am I doing? But if nothing else, I think I had this intuition that there's a connection there. Spock is a Christ figure. So when I've read your stuff about that, I've really appreciated how you lay it out. That makes me think, well, I wasn't crazy to make that connection.
I don't think you were, and I was. I feel like I can't. I don't think I'm at all the only. I know I'm not the only person to have ever found it. But what intrigued me about it was, and thank you for sharing that, by the way.
It was,
That's
teenager
impressive.
fanfic gone really, really weird. But you're welcome.
But I do think it's a really good example of how I think a lot of Christians like try to have a conversation between Star Trek and their faith, right?
Yeah.
And that can be a very difficult thing to do when you don't have much of a template for how to do that. And you do want to sort of force that direct imagery in there, especially if you grew up in evangelical tradition. You really want to kind of push that into it. And I think the biggest misperception that people have about my work is that that's what I'm trying to do. And the thing about all this is I always present it with sort of my palms up and my shoulders shrugged a little bit and being like, I don't know.
I didn't put it there.
Because literally, like, I just kind of thought, oh my gosh, Spock is a Christ figure, and then started watching the movies, and the next thing I knew, there was all this stuff. And if you read the book, it's really detailed.
Yeah.
And I think there's even more stuff that I didn't put in the book. That maybe in our audio commentaries, if I ever re-release those, you can hear about it there. But it's really crazy, and it's nothing that I planned, and it's nothing I was particularly looking for. It's very obvious, right? You can say, okay, Spock dies in Star Trek 2, Spock rises again in Star Trek 3. Ta-da! Christ figure, we're done, right? So, but I feel like that's kind of a low bar.
Right.
Because especially when you're talking about science fiction, because come on,
people die and come back a lot, and they're not all Christ figures.
right. Death is frequently a pause button in science fiction. So let's not get too impressed with ourselves for finding a character who rises from the dead. But it's what's interesting. It's all about like why he dies and how he dies and what that death means and how it's contextualized. And there's a lot that's in the story that, again, in these films, I can find absolutely no record of anyone involved. And if you have anything, if you know of anything like an old Starlog magazine or something, you've read a quotation from Ralph Winter or something like years ago, let me know, gospeltrekpodcast@gmail.com. But I have never found anything from anyone explicitly talking about Spock being modeled in any way as a Christ figure. In fact, Harv Bennett, who was the executive producer of these films, he's Jewish. I don't think he has a lot of motivation to tell a Christ story. Although Ralph Winter, who I mentioned earlier, is a Christian, he didn't have as much influence that I know of on the story. Harv really did, and of course there are a lot of I don't know. I'm never saying that any of this stuff is intentional or meant to be there to any degree, because I really have no evidence that it is. But it's kind of scary what's in there, the level of detail.
The parallels are plentiful, as you point out in your book, and there doesn't have to be evangelical intent to want to tap into the story of Jesus as it is one of the most powerful and foundational stories in Western culture.
That's fair. I'll steal Tim's line and say that's fair.
No, I mean, because as we were talking about Christ figures in Star Trek, and specifically about Spock, I got to wondering, what is it with Christ figures? Why is that? People know what you mean generally when you say so and so in any given work is a Christ figure, because it's just accepted that Western literature has Christ figures in it, and I got to thinking, why is that? So it's not any great stretch that creatives of any or no formal religious persuasion, Jewish, Christian, atheist, whatever, would know that this is a story that is so ingrained in our culture. To tap into that is to tap into something very powerful. So it needs to be done very well, right? I mean, if you go astray with it, it can lead to some disastrous artistic and spiritual results. But they're there. I mean,
but they're there, and the thing is, for me, talking about this stuff, is that the reason I talk about it is that it's been compelling and important for me to discover as a Christian. It's just been something that I found that I wasn't looking for, that kind of found me and set me on this whole journey of looking at Star Trek through a Christian perspective, and it's opened up so much stuff that's helped to deepen and broaden the scope of my faith. And so for me, it's just a great thing to talk about. I just enjoy it. And so take it for what it's worth. But yeah, obviously we have that dying and rising again thing that happens. But I think a really, really important thing about Spock's sacrifice in Star Trek II that makes it Christological is that it's specifically couched in Spock overcoming the accuser who's coming after Kirk, who's holding his past sins against him, who Kirk is fighting through this whole movie, this impending sense of age and mortality, right?
Yeah.
Age and mortality, which are, from a Christian perspective, products of the fall. Therefore, symptoms of the sinful nature, that creation is damaged and broken. The creation is good. The creation is fallen, and the creation can be and will be redeemed and renewed. And so that concept is very deep in the film, and there's so much Edenic imagery related to the Genesis project. When and that sort of hunger for, that thirst for Eden, when Carol takes Kirk into the cave for the first time. She says, "How do you feel?" And he says, "Old," and she says, "Let me show you something that will make you feel young, as when the world was new."
Right.
I mean, it's a direct Edenic reference, and of course, later in the cave, Kirk is seen there eating an apple, which of course, the apple is
right.
Apple is not biblical, but it is, sort of our image of Edenic fruit. And there's very much this theme of the restoration of Kirk. It's at the end of the film that he says, young, I feel young.
Yeah.
And so that to me helps give us this very Christological image of Spock in the films.
I think that's I like all that. I think the one reservation I have about the way Spock's death is handled in Star Trek II is it on some level it seems to come out of nowhere. I don't feel like the film builds to it real organically. There's the bit at the beginning with the Kobayashi Maru scenario, "Aren't you dead?" It's a little kind of ha-ha, and you talk about in the book how this was to make audiences think all those rumors about Spock dying had just been misinformed and he was going to be okay. But after that, it doesn't. You say Spock is gives his life to overcome the accuser.
Right.
Yes, except that there's very little direct opposition of Spock and Khan in the film.
Right.
I mean, he clearly gives his life to save the ship, to save his friends.
Right.
You argue in the book saving the Enterprise, the symbol of humanity.
Right.
I like all that. I don't see as much the opposition of Spock and Khan, but except to the extent that, of course, they're in danger because of Khan.
Right, right. Well, and I don't feel like it's much about opposition between Spock and Khan as much as it is actually about opposition between Kirk and Khan. I mean, I think that's the point, that in the struggle, if you will, between humans and their accuser, Christ comes in as an intermediary, you know, to win the battle for us. And that's kind of how I see it.
Yeah.
And that's why I feel that it's specifically rooted in Spock's friendship with Kirk, even though, of course, he's saving the whole crew. It's definitely specifically rooted in his friendship with Kirk, as we see not only Kirk having this very intimate encounter with him when he's dying, and you can see that this is a gift that Spock is giving Kirk in very many ways, and then also we focus on how the death affects Kirk afterward. It's his journey. It's he that who gives the eulogy. It's he who says, "I feel young," and it's that gives us the uplifting note. You know, when we go to the planet to see the torpedo tube. Right. So I feel like it's really rooted in that relationship.
Oh yeah, absolutely. I don't mean that it came out of nowhere in that sense. I meant more structurally. You know, like we don't even really know what that chamber is Spock's going into. It hasn't been set up as a gun on the mantelpiece, you know, that kind of thing. Right. But no, it's certainly very powerful. The bit about that death scene that always, the part I always tear up at is Spock's line to Kirk. I never took the Kobayashi Maru test until now. What do you think of my solution? It's not quite, I don't know, the way Nimoy delivers it is just so spot on. It's not quite it's not a rebuke at all, but it's almost as though to say, you know, this is the first thing that logically occurred to me, was that I will give myself to save the ship. Yeah. You know, everybody else who takes the test, that never occurs. You know, I'm probably reading too much into it. It's just, but it's that moment that always, that's right. And I think Shatner plays it that way too. Like his head goes down even a little lower than it already is as soon as Spock offers this observation. You know, that Spock had a novel solution to the no-win scenario. Right.
Well, the thing is also that he's kind of playing against the pathos there too. You know, where he's kind of you know, saying, so how do you like my idea?
How do you like them apples?
Not in a braggadocious way at all.
No, not at all.
But definitely in like a, so hey, this was my idea. And I agree. I think that's really powerful, because it is the win to the no-win scenario. You know, the idea that we can have a victory. There just has to be, as he terms it in Star Trek Into Darkness of all places, at great cost. And so I think that's an important thing to highlight, you know, about it, that it is important that sacrifice may not be something that had occurred to Kirk before that point. You know, may not have been a pattern that he took on, but he did take it on in the next movie.
Absolutely, yeah. I wonder if we went back through the original series, a couple of instances come to mind where I know Kirk was willing to sacrifice himself for the greater good. I can think of the Doomsday Machine. Sure. I mean, he was hoping that, you know, Scotty would beam him off in time, and I can think of some others, but also then I can think of Spock on a couple of occasions, the immunity syndrome being one that comes to mind. So I don't know. I've heard some fans complain sometimes that, you know, they rewrote the character so they could tell this story, but it's such a powerful story. you know, it's all good as far as I'm concerned.
I don't feel like the character was rewritten, but that's an
No,
interesting.
no. In fact,
perspective.
I like Spock in Star Trek 2 the best at any point along his. I'm a little bit in line with McCoy in Star Trek 5. I think I liked him better before he died.
That's funny. That's funny.
But I think you were going to steer us into Star Trek 3. And
I think so. I think so.
Pulled us back.
Yeah, I think Star Trek 2, I mean, there's a ton in there. And also we can talk about Spock's dual nature. That's something that all of our Christ figures have in common. She has dual nature, which is shown by his dual parentage. He is actually genetically half human and half Vulcan, and we can look at the Vulcan side as sort of a superhuman side. Not quite divine exactly, but definitely more than human, right? Smarter, faster,
Right.
stronger, all that
Right.
sort of bionic man stuff. And so there is a duality in him, a duality which he must balance within his life. And as he progresses, as he does this great superhuman thing, as he lays down his life, that's really when he becomes the most human. And that's what Kirk says at his funeral, which is the part that always gets me. Like,
Yeah.
I never cry at Spock's death. I always cry at his funeral. I don't know why. It's just that's the way it is. But of all the souls I've encountered, my travels, his was the most human.
Yeah.
And in the Star Trek world, where, from Gene Roddenberry's viewpoint, humanity is part of God. Humanity is divine.
Mm-hmm.
To say human is almost to say divine. So yeah, getting into Star Trek 3, we do see Kirk then go on a very self-sacrificial road in Star Trek 3.
Absolutely. I mean, that you talk about it in the book, that scene where Captain Styles is almost taunting him over the comms. You do this,
Yes.
Kirk. You'll never sit in the captain's chair again. Kirk sits down in the captain's chair and says, "Warp speed."
Mr.
To hell with
That's
it.
right.
He's thinking, this is my friend. I have to do this.
Yeah. And not
yeah.
only that, but it's interesting because at that time when Styles says you'll never sit in the captain's chair again, Kirk is an admiral.
Right.
And Styles is poking at him at the thing that he really values.
He knows where Kirk really wants to be. Yeah.
That's right. That's
Yeah.
right. And that's going to become important when we talk about Star Trek 4. But
Absolutely.
we'll get there in a minute. But yeah, so what's really interesting about this is, I call Star Trek 3 kind of like scripture jazz.
Right.
Like all the parts and pieces are there, but they're just in different order in different places. So people who are very square about their Christ figures, sorry, have gotten, they get to the point of Star Trek 3 and they're like, well, then that doesn't work at all, because yes, he returns from the dead, but his friends have to help him do it, and that's not how it worked in the Bible. That's not how Jesus did it. And I'm like, every analogy, every metaphor eventually breaks down in its ability to represent the thing that it's meant to represent.
That's why they're Christ figures and not
Yeah.
Christ himself.
Exactly. At a certain point, it's no longer the metaphor. Why don't you just make a Jesus movie? Like, yeah.
Then you're back to my fan fiction,
Right, exactly. Which honestly, these are Jesus movies for me. I mean, they really are. It's so crazy how ingrained this has become in my Easter experience. Years ago, when we were just the Undiscovered Country Project, before we did Gospel According to Star Trek, I had this really strong desire to sit down and watch Star Trek 2. And I was just like, I've got to watch Star Trek 2 because I got to see it. And I watched it. It completely escaped me that it was Easter Sunday or Palm Sunday, one of the two. I think it was Palm Sunday. And I said, I texted everybody who was on the team at the time, and I said, well, I just watched Star Trek 2, and at the end I realized, of course, it's Palm Sunday. Of course I'd want to watch a Jesus movie. But anyway, but in Star Trek 3, you have these sort of instances, like there are a couple of different resurrection scenes. The most
Right.
with notable biblical connections. So we're on the Enterprise, and there is a life form signal coming from Spock's quarters. So there is life where there should be none, right? We go there, and the door has been sealed. The seal has been broken, and the doors have been pushed away. There are guards standing there who were dressed weirdly like Roman soldiers.
Right.
Kirk walks in. He sees a figure he doesn't quite recognize because he thinks it's not Spock, but then it turns out to actually be Spock because McCoy speaks with Spock's voice. And then he says to Kirk, "Tell my friends to meet with me, to go to the place where I come from, Vulcan and meet with me there. Just like
Yeah.
Jesus says, tell my friends to meet me in Galilee. Like, what the heck?
Yeah, it is pretty remarkable.
It is.
Now this does get close to the issue I have with Star Trek 3, and I hope I'm not being square about things here. But I'll bring it up because I don't think it's ever quite clear in the film why they have to go get Spock's body, because McCoy's the keeper of the Katra. He's got the mind, but there's when they I don't think it's ever spelled out in the movie why, and maybe we're just supposed to assume, well, of course they all want Spock back as he was, but they should, as far as they know, at this point, I think in the Grissom knows that the two has soft landed, but Kirk and company, I don't believe, know that. So
it's I think it's essential. I mean, I think he has to, but that's again, I think that's part of the faith leap that Kirk takes in this film, because he doesn't really have evidence necessarily that Spock is there, but he has to try.
Yeah,
and it's very much an act of faith, and I think that's important.
Well, then fundamentally, is Star Trek 3 more about? I mean, one thing you do say in the book is that Spock is the central figure in this trilogy of movies. I think that is something of an overstatement. Because it seems to me, certainly in Star Trek 2 and 3, Kirk is the central figure. Dramatically speaking, in terms of plot and so forth.
Sure.
And then in Star Trek 4, it's very much a group effort. But,
right. Well, and that's a different thing. Like that's a different thing, and that'll come more in Star Trek 4 as well. But yeah, Spock is the driving force behind the narrative. Even if Kirk is our protagonist, Spock is our protagonist's reason.
Yeah,
right?
And I can see that, and that ties in well to the idea of a Christ figure. That in our lives as Christians, Jesus isn't literally here doing everything we're doing, living our lives for us in that sense. But we believe. We're living our lives in Christ, and that in God we live and move and have our being. So if you want to argue Spock's the central figure that way, I can see that working thematically.
Yeah, a central figure in terms of in terms of motivation. Like he doesn't hardly appear in the third movie, right? I mean, he does.
Yeah,
but
right.
Half the time he doesn't have a mind. It's Spock's brain all over again. Oh no.
I'll take Star Trek 3 over Spock's brain almost any day.
Absolutely any day. Yeah, I agree
that's
with you.
Interesting to think about that child Spock on the Genesis planet.
Yeah.
I mean, what would that child? Well, what would that child be if they hadn't been able to restore? If he hadn't been aging along with the planet, number one, and number two, if they hadn't been able to restore the Katra to the body, as you point out in the book, that's a mind-body split that Scripture doesn't have room for really in its worldview.
Right.
But
it's much more like a science fiction tool to give us a story.
Well, it's just very dualistic. It's Greek philosophy, the mind versus body split, where in both testaments, God, we are living embodied lives. God breathes life into the body made out of clay in the Old Testament, and in the New, Paul talks about we'll be raised with spiritual bodies, but it's always an embodied. There's no immortal soul that we possess that naturally survives after death. All life is God's gift, including our new lives. And our life is never outside some kind of embodied existence.
Right. In fact, we talked about this recently. Just over the weekend, I was on a YouTube show called The Scotch Trucker, and they contacted me to come and talk about resurrections in Star Trek films. And it's a really interesting conversation. I recommend you go check it out. I'll put a link in the description. But it was lots of fun. We had a panel, and they threw a lot of crazy stuff at me that I was not expecting. And it was fun.
I will listen.
Yeah, it was fun. We had a good time. We didn't just talk about resurrections. We talked about a lot of other stuff. But one of the things that we talked about in there was the idea of where our true self lies. Something that Tim quotes on the show a lot, is from C.S. Lewis, that we don't have souls. We are souls. We have bodies.
Yeah.
That the essence of who we are is our interior existence, and that's very much, I think, an ongoing theme in Star Trek. That who we are is who we are inside. That really is what matters most, and so I think Star Trek 3 is very much in line with that. And it's interesting because, I think if they hadn't got him off the planet, if they hadn't restored his Katra to him, then he would have just been obliterated along with the planet. I think he would have met the same fate as the planet.
That tracks.
Yeah, but it's interesting because it does introduce something that is a little weird. This idea of this shell of a being, that doesn't have a soul. I don't know if we've ever really seen that before, unless it was an artificial life form. I don't think we've ever seen that before in Star Trek. And so it's really interesting when McCoy says, "I've got all his marbles."
Right.
Which again is equating the soul with the mind, which I don't particularly have a problem with, personally. I think that obviously the soul is, as Data would term it in the episode Emergence, an emergent property, something that is more than the sum of its parts.
Yeah.
Consciousness, he terms it in that episode, more than simple neural function. I think there's definitely more to us than the electricity in our brains, but the fact of the matter is that the mind, whatever that is, our psychology, our emotions. I mean, we talk about the soul as if it's something else. And I don't feel like it has to be. I'm like, what else makes up our interior lives except our mind, our will, our emotions? That's who we are internally. So why can't that be equated with the soul? I don't see a problem with it.
Well, Jesus, sums up the law. You shall love the Lord your God with your heart, your soul, your mind, your strength. So it's got to be some internal energy, not in the just pure electricity sense. You understand? Just that it's our whole being, but wrapped up in this bodily package.
Right.
I think you mentioned in the book, and I really was interested to hear you say more about the restoration ritual, the Faltor Pan on Vulcan. Very clearly a religious ceremony. I mean, if that's not, that's even more so than the Kunet Kalafi in Amok Time. I mean, this is, you've got Vestal virgins and torches and the gong and, the big raised day. I mean, it's an elaborate, so I guess I would like to hear you say more about why you think they chose to present that as very overtly a religious or mystical, I guess, maybe spiritual, whatever terms use, but
that is religious, and one of the things, in fact, Sue from Women at Warp and I talked about this, I think in our second episode. I think we discussed it, that they had said, no, it was our first episode, I'm pretty sure. Listen to them both. She was talking about how they had kind of a debate on Women at Warp about whether the Vulcans were religious or not.
Oh,
I'm like, yes,
yeah,
they're
that's
religious.
right. You did talk about that.
They're absolutely religious. And one of the things that conversation brought out was, I think we need to be a little more inclusive about what our idea of religion is. And that our religious impulse, as it were, expresses itself in a lot of different ways. And that anything that we do that embodies our worldview, our beliefs, our spirituality, is our religion. Even if we're atheists and we embody our religion, we embody our beliefs by eschewing all forms of religion, Like I would say, Penn Jillette is a great example, because he says, look, everything that I do is based on my atheism. My view of humanity and being kind to others and how I take care of other people, like that's all rooted in my atheism.
Right.
And I think he recognizes, and that's how I have a lot of respect for him. He's like my favorite atheist, because I have a lot of respect for him because he recognizes the religious nature of his own existence, even though he's an atheist, because he's religiously committed to being an atheist. So I think we have to say, I mean, it can be air quotes spiritual or whatever. It's still religious. It's still that same impulse. So I think it's definitely a religious moment because you're talking about the essence of a person going back into their body. How are you going to do it? It has to be a big deal. Right. It has to be, it has to plug into something supernatural. It has to be, it has to involve like the mind meld and all that.
Yes.
Go
yeah,
ahead.
as you're talking about it, I'm thinking this goes back to the discussion of body and soul, right? It could have
Yeah.
just been glowy cloud floating from McCoy into Spock, but no,
Right.
it
It's
requires that
physical.
the priestly intermediary
Yes.
with the hand on each of their foreheads, and presumably it looks like a lot of physical effort on Talar's
Yes.
part to make that happen.
Yes.
Yeah, that religious impulse needs that bodily expression of some sort.
And that's what I think is so important about a Christian worldview as an incarnational worldview.
Yeah.
That it's about what we do and who we are with our physical lives. And so, her touching, between McCoy and Spock, I mean, it's like communion. It's like laying hands
Yeah.
on someone to pray for healing. It's like kneeling or standing ritualistically, in our liturgical services, whatever it may be. That bodily participation is very important to what we're doing.
Yeah.
And so that specifically makes it religious.
Yeah.
Because it's the acting out of this supernatural thing. So, and it's one of a couple times in Star Trek that I can point to and say, oh, look, we're having a group prayer service. as like the linchpin of the plot,
Right, right.
like in where no man has gone before, where no one has gone before in Next Generation.
Oh, that's
stuff
right,
like that.
for
I mean, it's
sure.
just like,
They're all kind of praying for the traveler, aren't they?
yeah, exactly. So
Yeah.
it's not a thing that's at all foreign to Star Trek, and I really like that element of it, because again, it's one of so many moments where Star Trek says that there's more to us than just our DNA,
Yeah.
than just our brainwaves, and there's more to what we're doing than pure scientism.
Right, right.
So I think that helps. It's one of many things that helps. Blair Monty and I talked about last episode about about religious representation in Star Trek, and that a religious impulse is still part of humanity, and I don't think it can ever go away. I think Gene kind of wanted it to.
Yeah, well,
he certainly wanted formal religion to go away, but I don't think he could ever harmonize that with the human need to find something sacred and beautiful.
right.
But Star Trek 3 is really it's a fascinating, and we have the other resurrection image in the film, which is when Savick and David go down to see the torpedo tube.
Right.
And they open it up, and Spock's body's gone. Again, it's a scripture jazz. It's
Just the burial robe left behind.
yeah, just the burial
Yeah.
robe left behind. It's like we had the time between the first discovery of the open tomb and then the second discovery of the open tomb. We have them both there, and I think that's fascinating. And then even with Krug coming there, there's this eschatological element to it. Where Krug is like an antichrist. I really fleshed this out in the book.
Yeah.
We're not going to have time for it on the show, but Krug is like an antichrist, and he's coming to steal and to kill and to destroy, just like Khan did in the previous movie.
Right.
And Kirk, ultimately at the end of this world, that he's come to, at the end of this world, he's cast into a lake of fire. So it's with three kicks, Father,
I
Son,
know.
Holy
I would
Spirit.
never have thought of that had you not pointed it out.
I don't know. You get into a headspace and just stuff comes out to you. I'm just like, it's a trinity of kicks. Why not?
Oh gosh.
And and depending too, and as we're discussing all of this, I mean, I know there are a lot of people who are kind of on the journey of figuring out what they believe about the resurrection, about the existence of hell or a devil or whatever, like Satan, like that. Like, I hear you, I'm with you. I wrestle with that stuff all the time.
Yeah.
So I'm not somebody who's like, well, you're not a good Christian if you don't, orthodoxly believe in all these things. I recognize that orthodoxy exists, and we need to ponder its mysteries, try to understand it. And we may end up, you may end up feeling like maybe some of this stuff is metaphorical or whatever. That's fine.
Well, yeah, I mean, what you're doing and what we're doing in this conversation is how does this story compare with the story of Scripture? But the story of Scripture has to be interpreted, and is interpreted in different ways. And so, I don't take umbrage at what you're saying, but I could understand how others who might have different beliefs could feel, oh, he's not talking to me because he's talking about the devil or the Antichrist or whatever. But
Right.
But I understand where you're going.
Well, in particular, when you talk about things like Antichrist and Revelation imagery and stuff like that, there have long been varying theories about what the Book of Revelation means, what's it for, how to understand it,
Right.
how whether it's been fulfilled or not, whether it was describing contemporary events, all that sort of stuff. We don't know. I mean, if we're honest about it, we don't really know.
Right.
And it is a matter of faith for you to try to decide what you really think it is. And it's okay to have that process, and it's okay to be not all there. Jesus only asks you to have a mustard seed of faith. And I don't think that means having all of your theological stuff nailed down. And in fact, I think the more we nail down our theological stuff, sometimes the more we miss the point.
Yeah.
And we miss some revelations that we might not otherwise have, because maybe we're wrong on some stuff. I grew up, I had a pastor years ago who said, that we'd like to hold our beliefs in an open hand. We have them, but we have them in an open hand because we're ready at any moment for God to slap them out of our hands.
Right. I think I've mentioned before that as part of my ministry now, I write curriculum, and I've written study guides for several books by Dr. Amy Jo Levine, who's a professor of New Testament at Vanderbilt and also an Orthodox Jew. And her mission is to, help Christians appreciate Jesus as a Jewish teacher, not just as a Jewish teacher, but as that, because that's important to understanding the Scripture.
Yes.
Anyway, long way of saying, she says that in the Jewish tradition, disciples are supposed to learn from their teacher and then question and wrestle with the teachings and then be able to teach others in turn and find more to teach. So she says in the Jewish tradition, disciples of rabbis are not just passive receptacles. They're supposed to be exploring and investigating and arguing and talking back sometimes, and but it's that relationship that holds them together, even in the midst of all that. So
yes, and I mean that goes right back to Plato and Aristotle as well. I mean that's a big part of the philosophical tradition. Like when we were emailing back and forth, and you were saying, "Oh, I've got some things, I've got some questions. I might take some issue with some of your stuff." I was like, "Dude, bring it! I love that." That's respect to me. Like I was a philosophy major. Like we did this kind of stuff all the time.
Right. It shows you're taking the other person's ideas seriously, right?
Yes,
that you're
absolutely.
not just saying, "Okay, yeah, whatever, Kevin, sure,
Yes.
Christ figure, okay, whatever, if it makes you happy."
Exactly.
Right.
So that's cool. So Star Trek 4. Let's touch on Star Trek 4.
Star Trek
before
4. Yeah, I mean Star Trek 4. That again, thematically, I could see it kind of Spock / Christ figure in the background. You say it all goes according to Spock's plan in Star Trek 4, but I don't know. Maybe it seems like they get a lot of lucky breaks in Star Trek 4, and it seems like it's a big group effort in Star Trek 4 too.
Absolutely, it's the most ensemble film of all of them, really. I would say everybody has stuff to do, and that's one of the great things I love about it. And it brings forward a little bit what we talked about in Star Trek 3. What we didn't talk about in Star Trek 3 was that one of the things that Star Trek 3 images is how we respond to what Christ has given us.
Right.
If we really believe that Christ died for us, however we understand that, whatever theory of atonement we might subscribe to, which I want you to touch on that before we leave.
Okay.
But whatever theory of atonement we might have subscribed to, how do we respond to what Christ has given us?
Yeah.
And acting on his behalf. We talk about that idea, remember me. Remembrance in Hebraic terms means to act again on someone's behalf, to act again as though they are here. So when we talk about remembrance with communion, it's very important that we think about the active element. And so everybody in Star Trek 3 is ready to give everything for Spock, because he gave everything for them.
Right.
And I think that's a great picture. And as we see them functioning together as a team in Star Trek 4, I think it's a beautiful example of how we as Christians and as humans on this planet should be working to complement one another, to find one another's strengths and give, the way jobs are delineated to each person according to their strengths, and they go and do them and they come together. I think that's beautiful.
It is. I can see that totally, because it's as Spock even says in Star Trek 2, when Kirk asks how the cadets will respond, he says, each according to their gifts.
Yes.
And that you see that in Star Trek 4. You're not going to send, Scotty out to, he needs to be there building the tank. Once he gets the plexiglass from Dr. Nichols, and you wouldn't send Chekhov to go fly the helicopter. I don't know, maybe you could,
Right,
but he's
right.
at that
Maybe
point
he
he's
could.
security. So they use, and that's the encouraging thing. If you look at this through your lens of Spock as the Christ metaphor, as the Christ figure, that the church, we're not all expected to do the same thing. We all have our differing gifts, and God can make use of those in differing ways.
Yes.
Absolutely. It's
So,
great.
yeah. So what I mean when I talk about Spock being the driving force behind everything, right, is that really we just would not be here without Spock. Everything that
Right.
happens, every major plot point that happens in this film, the reason we have, even that device that goes and collects the radiation, whatever,
Right.
to Spock built that. Spock came up with all of this stuff, and yes, he entrusted it to all of his friends to carry it out. But he's the driving force, and at the end when they're rocketing back not into 1985. That's the wrong movie.
Boy, crossing the streams there, Kevin. Great Scott.
when they're rocketing back into the future, Captain, I need full thruster control, and just the
Right.
idea. I just thought that was a little moment where you could say, yeah, Christ is in full control. No matter how chaotic things may seem to be around us, no matter how much she's shaking herself apart, Captain,
Right.
no matter how much that's happening, like still, yeah, he is in control, metaphorically, and very
Right.
much literally in that moment. And so I did not see Spock as a Christ figure in Star Trek 4 until that time where I was like, I want to watch Star Trek 2 just because I enjoy it. And then I was like, well, I got to watch Star Trek 3 to see the end of the story. And I was like, well, I'll just watch Star Trek 4 just to get them home and because it's fun. And I was totally not working for once watching Star Trek.
Yeah.
And then I got to the moment. I think it was the moment where the Federation president said, "Captain Spock, you do not stand accused," and Spock says, "I stand with my shipmates."
Right.
I think that's where I stopped the movie and rolled over for a while and just was like, ah!
They did it again.
Spock is Jesus in this movie too, because he's advocating for us at the throne of justice, and And then I started thinking, oh wait, but he's also restoring the world. Like he's coming back on the clouds with his followers, and he's bringing restoration. Humanity has caused their own destruction through their great sin of hunting the whales, and then, And so now that the whales have been hunted, now the probe is coming and it can't find what it's looking for, and that's going to end in our destruction unless it finds what it's looking for, and Spock comes to interpose sort of his righteousness, as you will, if you will, instead of ours. He brings his own whales, to stand in for the ones that we
remember,
killed.
though, they describe it in the movie as a lucky break. We couldn't have asked for it better. Two whales together.
Yeah.
But then Spock's the one who takes it upon himself to get the whale's consent.
Yes,
Which I
yes.
think is, if we're continuing this image of Christ figure, that's God's
That's super
graciousness.
great.
That God does not impose God's self on us.
Darn right.
God
Well said.
invites us to be part of the saving and the restoration and the, and so I think that ties in with it. And also, interestingly, in this movie, I think the Christ figure thing is fascinating, to coin a phrase, but I wouldn't want it to flatten the character Spock's journey in Star Trek 4, because he does
Absolutely not.
he goes on that arc of having to get back in touch with his humanity. Which, if that is getting back in touch with divinity in Gene Roddenberry's equation, I don't know where that goes. But that's
Right.
a really beautiful arc that he goes on in Star Trek 4, is rediscovering that he can trust that side of himself.
Right, and you can read that humanity divinity thing in different ways. I mean, it's not intentional, so you can play with it. I do, but yeah, definitely, and I think that's great because it, to use probably an inappropriate term, it humanizes Spock. That's what all of these movies do. That's what the movies progressively do. I think 2, 3, and 4, and I think that's really important because I think one of the things that we often lose in our discussions of theology is the humanity of Christ.
Good point.
And
Absolutely.
so the fullness of Christ's humanity is as much as the fullness of Christ's divinity. And so I think it's great that we have a Spock to whom we can relate. We have a Spock who is funny and swears, and we have a Spock who's like, yeah, and a Spock who is finding his way, getting his bearings, not always sure of himself.
Yeah.
I love that. I love that. And, because, I've mentioned it on the show before, my favorite film of all time is The Last Temptation of Christ. And it's because it is this great meditation on the relationship between Christ's humanity and Christ's divinity, and where those things intersect, and what that struggle of being both human and divine and discovering yourself as a human person might have been like. And so I see that in Spock all over. All through his story, but particularly I do see it in these three films, and I think it's fantastic. There's so much more. I mean, there's so much more to talk about in these three films. We are skimming the surface big time.
Yeah, I was even thinking, you mentioned the atonement earlier. I was even thinking in preparation for this, is it possible that each movie gives us a little slightly different lens on which to view the atonement? Because, there's three main theories of how Christ's death saves us in Christian thought. One is substitution. Christ dies in our place. And that clearly lines up with the Christ figure in Star Trek 2. Spock dies so that the Enterprise doesn't have to. Crew of the Enterprise, and Kirk especially, doesn't have to. And then I thought, well, then there's the theory of moral influence, which is basically the idea that we see Christ dying and our heart breaks open to God's love. And that could align up with Star Trek 3, that, as you said, the crew sees Spock's death and they're motivated to live sacrificially and to risk it all for his sake. The third major stream of thought is something called Christus Victor. And I think maybe you and Tim even mentioned it.
Yeah, we've talked about
that on an episode last year, where basically the idea is Christ saves us by dethroning the powers of sin and evil and death. And, just Christ is triumphant. And I don't know that this really lines up with Star Trek 4, but if we're talking about Spock having thruster control, well, maybe so. and I've mentioned luck a few times, but I'm thinking also the movies we're watching in my household right now are the Lord of the Rings movies, because my daughter's way into that right now.
Nice.
And Tolkien was a big believer that what we call luck is often God's providence, and that so we could look at Star Trek 4. The things that happen to everybody, Spock included. There's lots of providence going on in Star Trek 4. So maybe it's not Christus Victor, but it's a very strong analogy or allegory of God's providential sovereignty over life.
Well, and I mean there is a great sense of victory at the end there, and I think
absolutely.
And I think it is it is both Spock and Kirk's victory, which is important because Kirk is the word for the Scottish word for church,
right?
And I really do see Spock and Kirk in these films as Christ and the church, and there is a sense in which we who pursue Christ are brought into Christ's victory with him, and we share in that, and that is, and as Kirk is demoted, that's really his reward. Is to be put back in his proper place.
That's exactly what I was going to say. That's where he belongs.
Yeah, how many of us? I mean, we need to be rescued from our own human arrogance, and I think a proper relationship with God does that. And I agree with you about luck and providence. I think providence is all over this. Even when we talk about the 2009 film, JJ at one point objected to Bob and Alex, like, well, why is Spock all of a sudden exactly where he needs to be, and Scotty's there too, and it just sort of happens? Like, that's crazy. And they're like, that's because it's destiny. It's meant to be. It has to be that way. And JJ's like, oh, okay, I'll go with that. And I think there's a ton of that in Star Trek. Star Trek is all about like destiny and providence and all these things, especially that film. We can talk about predestination and stuff.
Well, I was going to say you can. I guess you can perhaps shade from a healthy, affirming theory of providence into a I don't know what the word I want is, a kind of fatalistic doctrine of predestination,
Right.
or I guess a double predestination, where God actively saves some and actively damns others,
Right.
or God sort of micromanages everything we do. That's not what I mean by providence, and I don't think you do either. But
No, I don't, and I think that film is a great. We could talk about it, but that film is a great example of it. A great balance of free will and determinism in that film.
those are the words. Yeah.
Yeah, because I really do believe, and I think that film actually helped me arrive at this conclusion theologically. I really do believe that there is a free will and there is chaos in the universe, and I also really do believe that God is absolutely sovereign, and that at the end of all things, God gets what God wants, and I really believe those work in harmony. Just like you were talking earlier about these different theories of atonement. The way they're talked about in theological circles is often as though they're in competition with each other.
Right.
And I really don't believe that's the case.
No, not at all. I agree.
I think they're all petals of the same flower.
Yeah.
And I think it's you got to let it bloom in your heart.
Oh, nice. Nicely said. Yeah.
Thank you. You do. You got to let it bloom, and that's part of what discipleship is. I was talking about earlier about you don't have to have it all figured out. None of the apostles had it figured out.
Right.
None of the disciples had it figured out, and there is a difference between an apostle and a disciple. But none of those people had it figured out. They were just following the best they knew how. In the tradition I grew up in, one of the great things that I drew from it was that my pastor used to lead a lot of prayers of salvation. And whatever you believe about this, the prayer of salvation, one of the most valuable things in that is this precious phrase that he used to say when he would tell you what to pray, right? Like you're in a group, every head bowed, every eye closed. And if you want to give your life to Jesus, pray this prayer with me right now. God, I know that I'm a sinner. I don't want to be a sinner any longer. I believe that you died on the cross and that you rose again to overcome my sin. And the thing that he said every time, which I've held on to my whole life, is, the best I know how, I give my heart and life to you today. The best I know how.
Yeah.
Man, come on.
Yeah.
Whatever you want to say about that process. I mean, I don't have any problem with that process of evangelization or any other, any process that we go through to find further faith in Christ is just great. But I would say that those are some of the most important words I ever heard, and I heard them over and over and over growing up. The best I know how.
Yeah.
That's all any of us can do. And so don't be down on yourself because you don't know whether you're a Calvinist or an Arminianist. I had a pastor who used to say, I guess
Jesus is not going to ask you that.
Right. I had a pastor who used to say, well, I'm not sure. I believe some things are from Calvinism and some things from Arminianism. So I guess I'm a Calvinist in an Armani suit. So, you don't have to have it all figured out. But I think if you go on the journey, like I said, letting it bloom in your heart. If you go on the journey, if you trust on that tiny little mustard seed of faith, whatever you have, that God is real, and just that God's love is real, and God's love is for you, yes, you, and God's love is for them, yes, them. No matter who you are, no matter where you are, that it's available to you, and God will do anything to tell you about God's love, even if He has to put on a pair of pointy ears to do it. So,
amen to that.
Yeah. So look for it everywhere because it's everywhere. So there you go. So that's a very quick whirlwind through Star Trek 2, 3, and 4. There's a lot more we can say. Check out the book, The Gospel According to Star Trek, The Original Crew. It's in there. I've got some writings on it around the interwebs too. I can come and speak for your church or your convention or whoever about it if you want me to go into more detail. But yeah, it's a fun ride. It's very cool. And I appreciate what you said about the forms of atonement. I wish you had come up with that when I was working on my book, but that's okay. Because I totally would have stolen it.
all in its good time, right?
All in its good time. That's right. Oh, I love it. So I think if you want us to do more episodes on this stuff, we could probably have done 3 or 4 episodes just on Spock as a Christ figure, just going through these movies. So if you want us to do more deep dives into these movies, let us know. Hit us up on social media and email and all that stuff, and let us know, and we'll do more. I think we have some audience question. Yeah,
I was told we do.
Okay, let's get an audience question.
All right, so here's our audience question. In your reviews of Discovery Season 3 and Episode 12, you, Kevin, mentioned in passing that Star Trek V is not your least favorite Star Trek movie. What is your least favorite Star Trek movie, and why?
Ah, fascinating. Okay. My least
Unless
favorite.
you don't want to
Star
go negative, but
Yeah, you know.
audience question,
My least favorite Star Trek movie is actually another movie with with Death and Resurrection in it, and is one that we talked about this weekend on Scotch Trekker, excuse me, and it's Star Trek Into Darkness.
Ah, yes.
Yeah.
Okay.
Star Trek Into Darkness is my least favorite. There are a number of reasons. Now, I mean, Insurrection is a close contender, and the Picard story of Nemesis is a close contender. Because Nemesis is really, really crummy in a lot of ways, but the Data story I think is golden. I love the Data story. Data story is why all this exists. We'll talk about that next week. But then, Insurrection is really close to the worst. But I really think Into Darkness is the worst because tonally it's so wrong. You have things like, when Spock is things like when Spock is raging again, like he raged last movie and it was okay, like it was acceptable, but now he's going to do it again just because it was successful last time, I guess. And you think the whole time, because you've figured out, at least I had figured out, that Khan's blood could save Kirk, and so you think he's just going to get some of Khan's blood. No, he's going to kill him.
No, he's
he
going to wail on Khan.
Yeah, he would have killed him if Uhura hadn't stopped him. I'm like, no, that's not right. That's totally wrong. You should have undercut that with, Khan thinking that Spock's going to kill him. And then what he really does is just knock him unconscious so that he can get the blood. That was his goal the whole time. That would have been better.
They've got neck pinches in the Kelvin timeline, right?
Well, they try. Yeah,
Presumably,
he tries a neck pinch on Khan, and Khan pushes through it. Yeah, see,
it's been a while since I've seen
Khan's
it. It's not
way
my
too
favorite.
strong in the movie, honestly. And I hate the Klingons, of course. The Klingons were gonna be in the first movie, and they cut that scene. It was on Rura Penthe and stuff, and I really love that they cut them in the first movie. I hate that they came into the second movie because they're thugs. They wear these long trench coats and these masks, these mask helmets. And I'm like, no Klingon would go into battle wearing a mask. Klingons want you to know who they are and where they come from, so you will know who took you down. They will take credit for what they did. That's why the guy in Star Trek V and Chang in Star Trek VI are so shameful in Klingon eyes, because they're attacking and hiding their faces. But stuff like that. But then also it's like bringing in all the Star Trek II stuff really, really badly.
Yes.
Like I would never have cast as Khan Eggs Benedict Cumberbund. I never would have. That's from Honest Trailers, Eggs Benedict Cumberbund. And I never would have cast him as Khan. I think he's a great actor, but he's a terrible casting for that. Alice Eve is terrible casting for Carol Marcus. Carol Marcus is not Carol Marcus. She's just a blonde. She's like a blonde woman who's into Kirk. That's the only thing, and her name is Carol Marcus. Like that's it. Every single thing about her character and her backstory is completely different. And no, the Kelvin time change does not account for that stuff. I love Peter Weller in the film, but his character is profoundly stupid. Because the whole plan is we're going to go, like he knows, right, that there's no fuel in these torpedoes because they're filled with Khan's friends and crew, right?
Yeah.
So he knows that. And yet his plan is to go shoot these torpedoes at Kronos when they can't get there because they don't have fuel. Like, what is wrong with... Gosh!
I didn't even remember that. It's been so long since I've seen that one.
What even would have happened if they shot them? They would have just like gone... they would have spit out of the torpedo base and just sat there in space because they can't get where they're going. It's so, and then the interstellar, like the idea that Spock, like one of the great things about the first movie is the transwarp beaming. When Scotty describes it, he's like, it's trying to hit a bullet with another bullet while blindfolded riding a horse. Like, that's not wrong, okay?
Right.
It's actually pretty good. And then when he looks at the solution, he says, oh, it never occurred to me to think of space as the think that space was the thing that was moving. Like, yes, that's exactly right. That's exactly how the problem is solved, because space is the thing that's moving. That has nothing to do with beaming from one star system to another with no pad on the other side, no signal degradation, and no pattern loss, and not running into an asteroid belt on the way. That's ridiculous. Gosh. I mean, Star Trek strains, credibility a lot, but no more than Into Darkness. And for no more payoff than we get for cheaply flipping the Spock Kirk death and resurrection thing.
Yeah.
For all the lousy writing and the terrible now it has some great dialogue. Bob and Alex were still writing great arguments at that point. The scene where Pike is dressing down Kirk and Spock is just fantastic. There's some great stuff. Michael Giacchino does some great stuff with the score, beautiful photography, great direction, good acting. All of that stuff is always good in Star Trek. It stands or falls on the writing. And my contention is the single worst written Star Trek is Into Darkness in terms of the movies. And I think it completely falls apart.
I think I would agree with you, because at least Insurrection, it's not my favorite, but it feels like a Next Generation episode. It's just a long one. So there's, that's solid. I agree with you, all your criticisms of the movie. I liked...
so many more.
What's that?
I have so many more, but go ahead.
I did like that they gave Uhura a little more to do. She got to speak Klingon, which was kind of cool. But yeah, I remember I was blogging for the Sci-Fi Christian when that came out, and I wrote a review in which I argued with myself over whether I'd enjoyed it or not, because at that point I couldn't decide. Oh, and I also talking about straining credulity. That the Enterprise is like a Timex watch. That's the ship that just takes a licking and keeps on ticking no matter what. But but as I've not. I think I've seen it 3 times, and that's the least I've seen any Star Trek movie. So, including Insurrection. So.
Yeah. Well, I've seen it several times. We did an audio commentary for it years ago, and I've seen it several times. And I had to write on it for the book, and of course I say positive in the book. There are positives, and it's really kind of cool the way the Christ figure symbology works out in that movie is actually kind of cool, and I actually like that bit. But only for my purposes. It's not worth it for the movie, and it's it just cheapens. It cheapens Star Trek 2. It does.
I'm afraid to say it does, and
it's horrible.
I went to see it with a friend, and we walked out, and I was grumbling. He said, "Oh, you just don't like it because it was riffing on your favorite Star Trek movie." I'm like, "Well, that's probably pretty insightful, actually."
not a bad.
What if I came along to your favorite movie and just broke it apart and shook all the pieces together and put them back any which way I pleased? How would you like that?
Right. So anyway, there you go. You got to hear me rant for
answered.
A little bit. Yep. You got to hear me rant for a little bit, and I could do more. But thank you so much for the question, because I don't always get to vent that, so I appreciate it.
Keep those questions coming, folks.
Keep them coming. Yes, that's awesome. All right, so Mike, what do we have coming up next week?
So next week, David Atwell will be back as co-host, and you and he will be talking about Data as a Christ figure in Star Trek.
That sounds fantastic. I'm excited about that. Yes, we're going to continue our series on Christ figures, so I hope you join us for that. In the meantime, please like, share, comment, rate, and subscribe, and also send us your questions. Gospel According to Star Trek on Twitter and Facebook and Instagram, or gospeltrekpodcast@gmail.com. We would love to discuss your question on the show. Also, you can support us on Patreon. We have lots of cool perks for you there, and your support really helps keep this show going. That's going to wrap it up for this edition of the Gospel According to Star Trek podcast. Thank you so much for being here. And until next time,
I'm Mike Poteet.
And I'm Kevin Senes. And as Jesus said in John 10:10, live long and prosper. See you next time.